They are the oldest mountains in the country, these Appalachian ridges and coves. For 500 million years, they have endured seismic upheaval and torrential rain. They have been racked by wildfire and hoarfrost. They have witnessed the triumphs and the tragedies of peoples beyond all reckoning. Yet still they stand, as they will for 1 billion years more. It was near the end of one of those countless years that I set out to explore a small piece of the Appalachians in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. My hike began at the Cades Cove Ranger Station. From the trailhead in the picnic area, I would take the Anthony Creek Trail and the Russell Field Trail up to the Appalachian Trail. There, I would spend the night at the Russell Field Shelter. On day 2, I would hike the Appalachian Trail to the Spence Field Shelter, where I would unload some of my gear. Then I would climb up to Rocky Top on Thunderhead Mountain for the sunset before returning to the shelter for the night. On day 3, I would make a long descent on the Boat Mountain and Anthony Creek trails, finally arriving back where I began. In the days before my arrival, a hurricane was the latest calamity to vent its fury upon those ancient slopes. Now it had passed, and it had taken the peak autumn color with it. The path was thick with fallen leaves, the air loamy with their smell. I identified the leaves as I crunched through them. Red and hickory oaks, tulip poplar, sourwood, black maple, shagbark hickory, sugar maple. And the leaves weren't the only color on the trail. Its margins were dotted with partridge berries. I plucked one and ate it. I have to admit that my palate isn't refined enough to appreciate the subtlety of a partridge berry. The hurricane may have passed, but the swollen creeks had not yet spent their rage. The great cataract of Anthony Creek overwhelmed the trail in places. Mostly, there were bridges for the crossing. But occasionally, there were not. After the last of the creek crossings, the trail grew steeper. The clouds began to break up. Sunlight pierced the dense growth of laurel that twisted itself into a bower over the trail. I stopped to rest and heard nothing but the sound of my own heart thrumming in my chest, pumping blood newly fortified with mountain air. I had reached the part of the hike where the veil of worldly concerns is thrown aside and I begin to see things with a clarity unmatched in my everyday life. Only after that point would I notice the beads of moisture on the sporophytes of a moss, or the row of British soldier lichens standing in glorious symbiosis. When the trail rose steeply again, I realized I was worn out from all the climbing. My legs ached, my bare hands were numb in the wind. The antiseptic smell of winter was on the air. But a view of the valley below gave me a sense of progress and satisfaction. Soon I reached a spring where I filled my water bag. Then I climbed toward the dark silhouette of the Russell Field shelter. I had expected to find it full and merry and ringing with laughter. Instead, I found it cold and dark and brutalized by the wind tearing through the gap. And it was empty, aside from a lone man sitting half-shadowed in the corner. He was Eric from Orlando, a section hiker working his way through the Smokies segment of the Appalachian Trail. After talking for a while, we realized that we were running out of daylight, so we cooked our dinners on a log outside the shelter. It was very cold out in the open. I put on all my layers, and still I shivered as I ate. By the time I returned to the shelter, it was nearly dark, and Eric was already in his sleeping bag on the bottom floor. I claimed the top floor. I was eager to begin warming up in my sleeping bag, but I wasn't tired. So, for an hour or so, I shared trail stories with Eric. His was a disembodied voice swirling in the darkness, but it was nevertheless a comfort. I woke shortly after sunrise to bid Eric a warm farewell on a cold morning. He had a lot of ground to cover this day. As for me, I had the luxury of a long morning at camp. When the sun was high enough to begin spilling into the gap, I set out on the Appalachian Trail. I walked the spine of the mountains with one foot in Tennessee and the other in North Carolina, with long views into both states. I passed through stands of naked birch and through swaths of goldenrod turned to fluff. Quartzite boulders looked less like rocks erupting from the trail and more like chunks of ice fallen from the sky and melting in the sun. Just before reaching the Spencefield shelter, there was a break in the trees, and the shape of Thunderhead Mountain appeared against the blue firmament. Later, I would climb it. First, however, it was time for a break at the shelter. After lunch, I unloaded half my gear in the shelter and set out for Rocky Top on Thunderhead Mountain. It was a difficult climb, but every time I stopped to catch my breath, it was taken away again by the views opening up all around me. Eventually, the trees gave way to laurel shrubs and yellowing grass, and when I turned around, I saw below me the rolling brown earth that I had left behind. With a few more steps, I gained Rocky Top at 5,441 feet. It was immediately worthwhile. All of the Great Smoky Mountains seemed to be laid out before me. The glittering waves of Fontana Lake, the green expanse of Cades Cove, the profiles of Mount LeConte and Klingman's Dome, the whole leafless interior of the mountain range. I was not alone at the top. I chatted with a number of day hikers and fellow backpackers. Like me, a few of them decided to stay until sunset, and so I got to know them over the next couple hours. One of them was Patrick, a walking encyclopedia of the Smokies who has hiked every one of its 900 trail miles at least 3 times. The wind grew fearsome. It rattled the bushes and made it difficult to stand up straight. It must have brought the temperature well below freezing. When I wasn't huddled near the ground trying to conserve warmth, I was looking out over the smoking, Smoky Mountains. The ridges turned blue and hazy. The shadows lengthened across Thunderhead Mountain. Hawks soared below my feet. The parhelia blazed with prismatic splendor, and as the sun dipped low, there emerged one of the finest sunsets of my life. In the end, it was just Patrick and me on the peak.
Yeah, I might see you on that trail. Stay warm, man. Warmish.
I think we both knew that we had shared a rare privilege, and we both knew that the other knew. It was with mutual respect that we finally parted ways. It was a dangerous walk back in the dark. At Spence Field, I stopped and turned off my headlamp. I noticed that I was no longer cold despite the violence of the wind. To my left, the last embers of the sunset cooled in the dark. To the right, the lights of Townsend glittered on the plain. Ahead, a few pinpricks of light marked the location of the shelter on the next ridge. And behind me, a Halloween full moon rose out of Thunderhead Mountain like a witching beacon. It cast a pale light across the grass, bright enough to guide my way. Back at the shelter, there was a fire in the hearth, and people were preparing dinner. I caught up with some of the hikers I had seen throughout the day. Several of us had been on the trail after dark, but soon everyone was accounted for. The moon continued to rise as I unpacked, filtered water, and prepared for a night's sleep in the shelter. I didn't sleep soundly. All night the wind roared terribly while rain battered the roof. At one point, I awoke to find a mouse dashing across my forehead, but at least I stayed warm and dry. A thick fog had rolled in overnight. Everyone woke up at about the same time, and we all made breakfast together and muttered a few comments about the weather. Then people began to set off in twos and threes. Some were headed farther north on the AT. Others, like me, were headed down the Boat Mountain Trail back to Cades Cove. My hike began in the fog. The skeletal trees were shaggy with moss. My route was entirely downhill, and it was mercifully easy. Periodically, there was a break in the trees, and I could see the fog clearing on the slopes. Eventually, a very welcome sun broke through. As I descended, I remembered that it was still autumn. The trees were no longer bare. I walked through stands of yellow tulip poplar, of gold and green maple, of red sourwood. There were splashes of color on the distant hills, too. During those last miles, I thought about the people I'd met on the trail. I'm a loner by nature. I enjoy solitude and introspection. I always say that I go into the woods in order to escape people for a little while. And that's true. But it's also true that some of my finest memories of the woods involve being with other people, often strangers. I never cease to be humbled by their generosity, encouragement, and hospitality. I'm grateful for their company, for the drinks and stories and music they have shared, and for the bulwark they have provided against the darkness and the cold. These are people who make it easier to appreciate civilization after a few days in the woods, and for that I thank them. Oh, and one more thing. Is it too late for pancakes? I don't think so.